Hello, my name is Christina, and I am a librarian with the Volusia County Public Library System. During October through February 28th of 2022, the Volusia County Public Library is offering anti-racism kits to patrons of all ages. Each kit will feature a selected title, along with materials that will aid in having difficult conversations around this topic. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from the Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the Florida Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. As part of this program, we have had a series of experts come in and talk with us. And today, we are going to be talking with Dr. Kideste Yusef of Bethune-Cookman University. Dr. Yusef, why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Kideste Yusef. I am a department chair of criminal justice and political science at Bethune-Cookman University. I'm also the assistant director for the Center for Law and Social Justice here. Would you like a little bit about my educational background? I went to, in undergrad, I went to Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. I have a bachelor's of arts in criminal justice and a master's in applied sociology from Old Dominion. I have a master's in criminal justice from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and then my PhD is in criminal justice public policy from the Graduate Center in John Jay College.
Wow, that is amazing. What drew you to the field of criminal justice?
Well, I grew up, I'm an 80s baby, a 90s baby, and I grew up in the age of understanding the role of like the war on drugs and the disparate impact it had on Black and Brown communities. I grew up in a suburban kind of neighborhood, but still my family was very culturally aware. And so I was kind of made at an early age to understand the impact of policy and law on particularly African Americans. And so I was drawn into law initially, like I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And then in undergrad, I did some shadowing of lawyers. And in my mind, I had like an adversarial image where it was like the good and the bad, and you investigate till the truth emerges. And what I found in like interning was that it's not really like that. That 92% of cases are handled through plea bargaining. Most of the time, the lawyers on both sides know each other, and it was really about access to resources. And so I decided to just pursue education as opposed to going into law school. And then some of my mentors was like, you write pretty well. Why don't you consider teaching? And I fell in love with that. And so my specialization in my PhD is on law and public policy. And so I'm really very much interested in the law and policy, but more from an academic perspective.
The criminal justice system covers 3 areas: law enforcement, the courts, and corrections facilities. In the last year, Americans witnessed the increasing mistrust of police by members of the community. What are some of the issues that cause this mistrust?
Well, like you said, the first line of contact with the community and in the public with the criminal justice system is law enforcement. And so policing has a huge role in how we perceive not only just the criminal justice system, but other social services, our government in general. Historically, police systems have been set up to secure and protect the interest and the property of those who have power and money, oftentimes at the expense of those who do not. And so since the beginning of policing, since the establishment of like bounty hunters and slave patrols, there has been this history of racialized police systems where police have essentially protected whites at the expense of all other groups, particularly white males with power. But that's kind of, extended to other groups in current society. And so historically, when African Americans, Black and Brown folks have seen the police, it's been to go in and remove, even if it's the bad person, remove people. But it's not really about protection. It's not a feeling of security when you see law enforcement. And so a lot of these issues are historical in nature. They're really based on the history and the current practices of disparate policing in Black and Brown communities. And it's tied, because the series is about anti-Black racism, it's tied to broader systems of social injustice. And so African Americans are disproportionately more likely to live in lower income, high crime areas, and that influences the type and the nature of policing that those communities receive and experience. And so what George Floyd in particular did was, because we were in a pandemic, we couldn't ignore it. We couldn't just walk away. People were at home, they were glued to their TVs. And we saw an officer of the law, Derek Chauvin, like just willfully disregard the life of someone in a very casual way. And I think that it touched not just Americans, but people all over the world. And so it really kind of brought this issue to head. But that's some of the basis of the mistrust, is the disparate practices and the lack of accountability historically.
What are some of the solutions for communities to build trust between law enforcement and communities?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, particularly after last summer. Some of it is increased police accountability, so that if we know that as a profession, most police officers are law abiding, they're there in the current age to protect and serve all community members. But there are officers who shouldn't be officers in the force. And so part of that responsibility as citizens is to remove those individuals, excuse me, remove those individuals from the force when there are incidences that occur, to be transparent and hold those officers accountable. Part of my role as the assistant director of the center here, Bethune-Cookman has a really good relationship in police community training. And so part of what we do is train police officers in communities. We've been in almost every county in Florida, Volusia, Seminole, all through Orlando, Paramore, Mercy Drive. And what we do is we hold sessions with officers in terms of training officers on implicit, explicit bias, engagement strategies, the history of policing, so that they understand and recognize why certain community members aren't as trusting. We train community members on their responsibilities, their rights, how to engage with police, implicit bias as well. And then we put them together and we create action plans for the city. So part of what is required is building trust. And sometimes that means seeing the police in non-enforcement positive encounters. So you need to see the police playing basketball, saying hi, handing out whatever services, responding and following back if there is an arrest, to check on the family or hold events in the community. Some of that is just really the nitty gritty, the hard work, the day-to-day actions of repairing the harm. And from the community's perspective, also acknowledging when an officer is doing something right, saying thank you for your service, because oftentimes a lot of us, even in education, are in jobs that don't receive a lot of praise or thanks. And so most people who are in this field do it because they care and they want to give back. And so it's really establishing ways for community members and law enforcement to work together via community policing to solve crime and prevent crime in our communities.
What efforts are underway in the courts to address racial inequities?
Well, if we're speaking about policing, like since the aftermath of George Floyd was the 8 Can't Wait, and there was a series of recommendations to increase police accountability and transparency and reduce police misconduct. And so some of those were banning chokeholds, duty to intervene, meaning if other officers are present, they have a duty to intervene. Some might include the banning of shooting at moving vehicles, de-escalation training and requirements. And so there are a series of things, the George Floyd Truth in Policing Act. And while there has not been a lot of legway in the courts, there are different jurisdictions within Florida who have adopted aspects of that. And so, there are agencies who have banned chokeholds, or there are agencies who have adhered to, different parts of the guidelines, but there really are national movements to decrease the level of force, to use a use of force continuum, to have warnings before you shoot. Like there are there are efforts in the courts that are, in earnest, moving very slowly. But I think the first step is, like the guilty verdict, holding officers accountable so that it restores trust in the community, because historically we haven't been doing that.
Corrections is the third area of the criminal justice system. What are some of the effects of racial disparity in prisons?
Well, we know all these systems are connected, and they're connected to systems of law. And so while the law in and of itself, present day, like we've reduced the drug disparity to crack to powder cocaine, where it's not 100-to-1, and but the way in which we enforce the law and the sentencing is still very disparate outcomes. And so we know that if someone goes to prison and has a record, now more than 90% of those individuals are going to return home to communities. So what we do in prison, whether it be to offer services, education, rehabilitate, mental health, substance abuse, all of those things impact the type of individual who comes home, right? Who we return back to our communities. But when you add a criminal conviction on top of all the issues that led to someone being in prison, it has a direct impact on quality of life. So access to job opportunities, which means what you can afford, where you can live, meriting situations. It impacts the type of um, what you have to offer in terms of whether someone is willing to date you and marry you. And we know from research, particularly like Pager's study, that it has an impact on all groups. We know that white criminals who go for job interviews are half as likely to get called back than people who don't have a criminal record. But for race, we know that African Americans with criminal records are African Americans without criminal records are even less likely to get called back than whites with criminal records. So if you're African American and you go to prison, the chances of you finding secure income when you come home without radical changes in the way we do things and having intentional policies that offer incentives to employers, or we have work to do as it relates to addressing the disparities within prison.
What reform recommendations and processes are working to rectify these disparities?
Well, I think that there's been some benefits and some pros and cons of the no bail reform, so the no cash bail. So we're not punishing people who can't afford to bail themselves out. There have been restorative justice as a movement has worked for certain crimes. So the idea that we are decriminalizing the certain crimes and allowing the opportunity to restore the victim and see what's best for the victim in the case. So different restorative justice models. There are drug courts. There are different types of innovative courts and systems that have worked to decriminalize certain offenses and treat it more as a mental health issue. We see that much more with the opioid crisis as opposed to what the reaction was with crack cocaine. So, I mean, there's racial bias even in our reaction, but I do think as a society, we understand that just putting people away and locking them up and then letting them go is not going to be beneficial to our society. So we have to figure out whether it's, enhancing halfway houses and making sure that inmates, returning citizens have access to voter rights if they've got their record expunged, or having a identification card and a place to stay, because those are the basic requirements if you try to apply, right? You need ID, you need a reliable location to receive mail. And so I think that those are some of the things that we need to do. Of course, mental health, drug substance abuse programs, providing more of those services to those returning citizens.
Well, so one of the ways we've been closing out these interviews is that we ask the person we are interviewing what book or books have influenced them. So do you have a title that influenced you?
I think that this has influenced my work in social justice, probably the autobiography of Malcolm X, coming into that as a child. But I also think that everything by Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston are and when I need a reprieve, Octavia Butler is high on my list. So I think that I have a mixture of history and fantasy that I like to escape to. So reading is essential and so important.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yusef, for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.